When you've just lost big in a game of chance, there's a strong temptation to think next time you roll the dice, you won't lose that big again, that you're due some luck. This is known as the gambler's fallacy. It's just not true that losing big once or losing big over and over again means you're due some luck. It doesn't work like that when the events are independent. The gambler's fallacy, I think, is a fallacy that is almost irresistible when we think about pandemics. Scientists have worried for a very long time about the risk of a flu pandemic. We had large documents drawing up our pandemic influenza strategy. We had whole groups dedicated to preparing the country for pandemic influenza. It was regarded as the greatest risk to our country, and many countries around the world also saw it as the greatest risk to them. It's almost irresistible to think that the fact we've now had a massive coronavirus pandemic somehow means that risk has gone away, at least for a while, that surely we'll get a reprieve, that we wouldn't get pandemic influenza this year or next year. But that's the gambler's fallacy. In fact, the probability of an influenza pandemic is virtually unaffected by the fact we're currently having a pandemic of a different disease, a coronavirus, unless the experience of the coronavirus pandemic leads to a step change in the way we think about the risk of future pandemics, in the way we think about the precautions we take. Now, it's a wide point of agreement, I think, that pandemics are serious risks and we should take precautions to try and reduce that risk. People have said such things for a very long time. The idea that we should take precautions against grave risks, even when we're not sure they'll materialise, is an idea often called the precautionary principle. It's also a wide point of agreement that those precautions we take should be proportionate to the risk in some sense, that they should do enough to get the risk below a certain level, but they shouldn't do too much. They shouldn't be excessive. They shouldn't go beyond the sort of precautions that it's reasonable to require from people. I think when it comes to pandemics, there needs to be a step change in how we think about proportionality. That in the past we've identified the risk, clearly. We knew there was a risk. But the sort of steps we've regarded as proportionate to managing that risk have in fact been totally inadequate. I think the drivers of new diseases, zoonotic diseases, diseases moving from animal hosts to humans, are well known. And the most severe drivers are anthropogenic. They are human behaviour. In particular, it's well known that surging global demand for meat, plus intensive methods of meat production, substantially increase the risk of these diseases emerging. The dense packing of animals into small spaces in intensive meat production creates this golden opportunity for a virus to move from a wild population into a domestic animal population where it can spread incredibly easily. We've seen that happening with avian influenza. We've seen it happening with H5N1. H5N1 has been regarded for a very long time as one of the gravest threats to humanity. This is a flu strain that in wild populations was not all that severe, not all that virulent, but it jumped across to domestic populations of poultry, where you have tens of thousands of birds close packed in small sheds. In that environment, viruses are under a selection pressure to evolve to transmit extremely fast, to get emitted from their hosts as quickly as they can, and they're not under any particularly strong selection pressure to preserve their host life. What we've seen is that H5N1 became incredibly virulent once it was in domestic poultry populations. In those rare cases where it has infected a human, it's often thought to have an infection fatality rate of somewhere around 60%, potentially around 60 times worse than COVID-19. So when we've thought in the past about measures that are proportionate to that risk, we've tended to think small. We've thought, well, what if we could bring in rules to stop poultry farms being located close to swine farms, to pig farms, to reduce the risk of the virus moving from poultry to pigs to us? Well, that's a perfectly sensible step. But to my mind, it hardly seems proportionate to a risk that threatens the very future of our civilization. It's also widely recognised that the wildlife trade substantially increases the risk of these diseases emerging. I think we need to be thinking about much stronger steps to prevent future pandemics. I think there's a lot more that we can do that is still proportionate. In particular, steps we can take that it's reasonable to actually require of people as long as we compensate those who are affected. I think in particular that we can seek to entirely eliminate the wildlife trade. China has already brought in a ban on wildlife trade in light of COVID-19. It only covers uses of animals for food, so the trade in wildlife for other purposes continues. I think all countries should be seeking to ban all trade in wildlife. I don't see why that's not a proportionate step. But we need to think even bigger than that, I think. We need to be looking to phase out intensive farming of animals for meat, for the sake of our own health. We need to be ending this practice. It doesn't have to happen instantly, it can happen gradually. But I think it's clear that it does have to happen. In particular, instead of subsidising operations that are farming animals incredibly intensively, we need to be withdrawing those subsidies and instead subsidising different kinds of farming. Ideally, farming that doesn't involve intensive meat production of any kind. And my final proposal is that governments need to be subsidising, incentivising changes in diet. They need to be incentivising reductions in meat consumption. We've seen meat consumption globally rising and rising over recent decades to a level where the risk of carrying on like this is simply too great. Governments can step in to incentivise people through tax and other ways to reduce their meat consumption. It doesn't have to be all about incentivising people to become entirely vegetarian and vegan, but subsidising initiatives where one day of the week is a meat-free day. Of course there will be costs. Of course there will be significant compensation, I think, that should properly be paid in cases where intensive farming operations are told to stop. It will cost money. But the costs, surely far, far lower than the costs of a future pandemic that has the potential to be even worse than the one we've been experiencing over the past year. Governments that do these things can feel as though they're part of the solution rather than part of the problem, that they're taking meaningful steps to reduce the risk of future viruses jumping from animal hosts to humans. I think that has to be, if not the priority, then a major priority when it comes to shaping the post-COVID world.